Mike Zervikis is an iceman, one of these men who ice the refrigerator cars. Another character in the novel is Israel Sullivan, born of a Jewish mother and an Irish father. A great iceman who eventually had to retire because arthritis had crippled his great fingers. But he and Mike remain close friends. And the short passage I'm going to read is of Mike going to visit Israel in a bar, in a restaurant. So at little after 2 o'clock, Mike walked beneath the faded sign of the Santorini bar and down a short flight of stairs. He entered a dimly lit basement room, roasted by the aroma of brandies and rank cigars. Leonidas Simis, the owner, short, stocky, and with a thick mustache, greeted Mike heartily. He motioned brusquely toward a shadowed alcove. "The old Minotaur is already here, Mike," he said. "I'll bring you brandy and coffee right away." Mike took off his jacket and cap as he walked to the corner table to join Israel, the giant he had first seen icing at the stockyards 30 years earlier. The old iceman, grown gnarled and white-haired, sat musing over his brandy. When Israel saw Mike, a warm smile illuminated his face. As Mike clasped the iceman's huge hand, he felt the gnarled fingers and swollen knuckles of the crippling arthritis that had ended Israel's icing. "Sorry I'm late, Israel," Mike said. "I'm having more and more trouble dragging my dead ass out of bed." "Waiting for you gave me time to sit and ponder my life," Israel said. "I wondered what the world would gain if I stayed around a little longer. Then again, what would the world lose if I departed?" I think really the first conception I had that I wanted to write came during the period of my illness. When I was about 11, I came down with children's tuberculosis. And at that time, the only therapy was bed rest. And so the doctor initially ordered me to bed for a month. The month became a second month, a third month, 6 months, a year, and I spent 2 years in bed. Prior to that, I hadn't been much of a reader. So what do you do in bed all day long? Initially, I read comic books, which I had read before my illness, but as I exhausted them, I moved on to other books, and I began to read, and reading allowed me to escape the imprisonment of my room. And so I became a voracious reader, and I would read sometimes a book a day or a book a day and a half to finish a book. And my brothers and sisters and my father and mother would buy up a batch of 6 or 8 books from one of these stalls, a bookshop stall outside in the sidewalk where they had books a quarter apiece. And they'd put 10 books together, just pick out 10 books and bring them home to me and give them to me. And I'd read them, I'd consume them, and I loved the stories, especially the romantic historical novels, Sir Walter Scott, Ivanhoe, the tales of King Arthur. And somewhere in this period of time, as I read these stories, I think the seed, the germination of the fact that I might like to write stories myself came to fruition. And it was probably as a result of that 2 years in bed that I turned to writing, I think because it opened the world of books and literature to me. Started by writing some poetry, not very good poetry, and published one in the little church newspaper called Ephemeral Splendor, which was a love poem to one of the girls in my class, and one of the trustees of the church thought it was indecent and carried it to my father with indignation and said, "You should get this boy a job in a grocery store and shake some sense into him." But that was kind of the beginning. This was my first published story. I published several more stories, and then I wrote a book. I worked for about a year on a novel. Its title was Cry the Black Tears, and it's the novel a writer writes to get out of his system what he shouldn't write and get on to his real work. And it was a dreadful novel. It's buried somewhere in the bottom of a closet. Never was published, of course. I sent it off to a number of editors, and it was rejected. And I started another book called Lion in My Heart. And it was a story of a young man and his brother and an old Greek father who worked at a blast furnace in the South Side steel mills, where I had worked, so I knew something about the mills and the furnaces. And this man belonged with Homer's Greeks before Troy, but not being able to join that battle, he found a kind of compensation for it in the great blast furnaces at the mills. But he was also very old country, locked to the old country traditions. And the story revolves around the older son having fallen in love for an Irish girl named Sheila Cleary, and how the father would not permit it, would not tolerate it because she wasn't Greek. And how the younger son then, caught between love for his father and love for his brother, tries to help resolve their problem. So I had done about 60 pages of it, sent it to a fine agent named Tony Strassman I had by this time acquired. And I was going to Pittsburgh to interview for a job that my brother Dan, who worked as an executive for U.S. Steel, had obtained for me, a job interview. On the way, I stopped in New York to meet with Tony Strassman, my agent. She had arranged a visit for me at Viking Press, which was a major publishing house. And they were going to talk to me about the pages, and just to meet them, she said anyway. So I went up and I met the two great editors at Viking Press. One of them was Marshall Best, and the other was a great white-haired editor named Pascal Covici, who is famous as an editor agent. He had agented for Thomas Wolfe and Ernest Hemingway. And I met them in the office with Tony Strassman. And they talked of my novel, and they praised my novel, and they praised my writing, and told me they were giving me an option with a $1,500 advance, a contract for the completion and publication of the novel. And it was a marvelous moment. I'm asked by people after lectures what work is my favorite, or what work I feel closest to. And it's a little like asking a parent, who is your favorite child? It's hard. They're all your children. All my books belong to certain parts of my life. And there are certain books. A Dream of Kings was the most pleasure to write. I laughed as I wrote it because of the hilarious dimensions and exaggerations of the character Leonidas Matsoukas, who headed the Pindar Master Counseling Service, was a doctor of inspiration and doctor of wisdom in life, and was a specialist in astrology, numerology, palmistry, dream analysis, inspiration to overcome drinking, bedwetting, and impotence. And just creating this larger-than-life character was a delight, and it was a book that was a great pleasure to write.
And we made money.
We made money on it, too, yeah. It was the most successful of my books, in that it became a national bestseller, was on the New York Times list for about 12 weeks in about 7th or 8th place, became sold to paperback and to book club and into a dozen foreign editions, and ultimately the Hollywood experience, which is another whole story. And but the book, the most difficult books to write were the War of Independence novels, which took me years of research. And I'm not really much of a researcher. I don't enjoy the research as much as I do the writing, but I needed there historically to get my facts right, to read the historians, to read of the people who lived through that period and actually wrote of it, and to recapture the dimensions of these epic figures I remember from the celebrations of my childhood. Certain books, short novels, were very fulfilling in that I feel I pulled off something in that they ended up almost flawlessly structured. One was Twilight of the Ice, which is the recreation of a way of life for men who were great athletes who iced the refrigerator cars in a time when manual refrigeration of these cars was ending and the diesel refrigerations were coming in. So these were artists, craftsmen, agile athletes, superb athletes, whose work would no longer be useful, was no longer needed. So it was a dying way of life that I lived through working there for a while, not on the trucks themselves, but in the office as a dispatcher. And Twilight of the Ice is a favorite. And Legends of Glory, because I wrote legends out of my feelings of anger and futility at the uselessness of the Iraq War. And so I created a fictional town similar to the small Indiana town where I live. I called it Provincefeld, and created a military family where a young son grows up, goes into the Marines, and dies in Iraq. And that too had a kind of fullness to it, a sense that I had structured it just right, and that every piece fitted just accurately.
So, my name is John Manta. I'm Harry Petrakis' great nephew. My favorite story was Upon the Sad Turkeys. Upon the Sad Turkeys was a great story that was based on, the way I understand it, Uncle Harry's real life when he ran a restaurant, and just put a lot of heart and soul into that story. I like it because I think it's probably one of the funniest stories I've ever read, and I still to this day read it. When I talk to people about my uncle being an author, I give them that story to read. It's short, with the attention span of people nowadays, and it's just a great story. And it's a great story about a struggling restaurateur who trying to make it buys a box of sick turkeys. And my favorite line in the book is he buys them from kind of a shady buyer, and the turkeys, he opens up the crate and the turkeys are brown. And the restaurateur, and I believe this is a true story, that was really Uncle Harry, but the restaurateur says, well, those turkeys don't look well, they look brown. And the shady salesman says, oh, they're from Florida. And that's one of my favorite lines of any book. And it's just a great story. It talks about, it's a depth, you get a lot of depth of the characters, and you really can empathize growing up in the great community with all the individuals in the story.
I'm John Petrakis. I'm the second son in the family. Favorite books? I'm very partial, actually, to my father's short stories. His early short stories. A book of collection of stories called Pericles on 31st Street. My favorite short story of all is a story called The Song of Rodanthe, which was one of his very early stories. I think he became more skilled as a writer. He moved on from short stories to novels. I've always admired my father's work. I think he's a very visual writer. Of his novels, my favorite, I think, is actually a much later novel called Days of Vengeance, which is a story about revenge that starts in Greece and ends up back in the United States. And he and I have talked many times over the years about perhaps turning that into a movie, because I think it would be a great movie. It's a very sprawling story, and I remember when I read it, writing him a letter, which I don't always do, because he'll normally send me the galleys to read things before they're published. And I wrote him telling him how wonderful a book I thought it was. And
another story of Uncle Harry's that kind of spoke to me a lot was a story called Legends of Glory. And I think the reason I liked it so much was it was like a bit of a departure of his typical or normal writing. His typical stories are really circled around the Greek culture and family and religion and tradition, at least the ones I'm familiar with. But this one took place in a, right outside of Gary or Hammond, Indiana, kind of Americana. And it was about a family that had generations of people that were veterans of different wars, a grandfather, and then there was the father, and then the son. And the son was, very was a football player and popular and everything else. And he decided that he wanted to join the service. And it takes place in the modern era during the conflict or war that's going on now or did. And so it was kind of, the mother and the father were very against their son going off to war, whereas the grandfather, who the boy looked up to, was more, kind of giving him, kind of mentoring him, or in a way saying, hey, if this is what you believe in your country, you owe it to them. And I won't tell you how the story ends, but it's a conflict because they're on both sides of a tough situation. And again, it was really neat to see Uncle Harry go outside of his comfort zone, I guess, with his writing. And it just shows you what kind of range he has as an author. And maybe that has something to do with the fact that he's been doing this for so long that he could draw inspiration or stories from all aspects of life, not just the culture or faith or the religion that he grew up with or understood. So it's great. It was a great story, and kind of like touches you, right? So that was neat.
I'm sometimes asked where I think I place myself in the literary hierarchy. I have no idea. That's for posterity to do. I think so much of what is written today is transitory. It belongs to the political commentary of the moment, or the mistress of this politician, or the politician himself, or the transgressors, the celebrity cooks, the celebrities. And I think this is writing that will exist for a short period of time and then pass. Whether my work will endure, I don't know. I can't really say. I would hope that 50 years after I'm gone, some student in a library will take down one of my books and will read it and will feel for a little while entranced and returned into a world that I created. I think sometimes my work is good enough and will endure. And other times, like one night I had a dream. My sons think I made it up, but I really had a dream in which I saw my epitaph. And the epitaph was, "Petrakis lies here 60 years a scribe, his books forgotten, no one knows he died." Whether that turns true or not, we don't know. It's up to posterity. But now, in the twilight of my life, I can only once again summarize it: gratefulness. With all the blunders and all the errors and all the mistakes, it's still been a marvelously fulfilling and exciting journey.